It's 1962, and President Kennedy is set to visit Germany for the 75th anniversary of Adolf Hitler's regime. The trip isn't unexpected, given that, in this alternate reality, the Third Reich and the United States are the sole nuclear superpower. This scenario stems from a world where the Normandy Landing failed. The narrative unfolds in Robert Harris's novel, Fatherland, where the plot centers on a victorious Germany where the populace remains oblivious to the Holocaust's atrocities and the extermination of the Jews. While this might seem unbelievable today, the Nazis not only refrained from publicizing their worst crime but also effectively concealed it for an extended period. The successful concealment of the Jewish situation in the Reich endured for an extended period primarily because the broader European population showed minimal concern about the fate of the Jews. Antisemitism, ingrained in European life throughout history, manifested in Jewish pogroms for various reasons. Notably, during the Crusades, those liberating the Holy Sepulchre on their journey to Jerusalem often couldn't bypass Jewish neighborhoods, reaching the Holy Land proper. In 1920, Jews became part of one of Europe's earliest immigration crises. Following the Russian Revolution and the collapse of Austria-Hungary, tens of thousands of Eastern Jews fled to Germany to escape starvation and religious persecution in Soviet Russia. Interestingly, the term pogrom originated from Russian during this period. These migrants, predominantly rural Jews, were perceived by enlightened Europeans as somewhat primitive due to their unfamiliar religious traditions, like those of the Hasidim, the peculiar Yiddish language often mistaken for incorrect German, and customs such as slaughtering cows by slitting their throats. Despite a 1918 decree forbidding Eastern European Jews from entering the Second Reich after the Brest Peace, the ban lasted only a few months. The November Revolution in Germany prompted the new Republican government to lift this ban, applying a so-called principle of patience to Eastern European Jews. Authorities reasoned that Jews who had fled Poland or Ukraine had no viable return option. While not forcibly removed from the country, they were prohibited from earning a livelihood. Consequently, many neighborhoods in Berlin, where Jewish migrants settled, transformed into ghettos with the presence of criminal gangs. Berlin didn't have a sizable Jewish population, only around 70,000 Jewish migrants resided there. However, even this relatively modest number was enough for Germans to perceive Jews primarily as a barbaric horde from the East. The German state's provision of economic aid to refugees during economic crises might have played a role in shaping these perceptions. Not only in Germany were Jews viewed negatively. In 1933, the Stavisky affair in France, involving a Jewish immigrant from Ukraine orchestrating a multi-million-dollar financial scam with fake bank checks, stirred mass protests and allowed French fascists to nearly seize control of the country. By the early 1930s, many in Europe, especially regarding Eastern European Jews, viewed Jews as a problem that needed solving. Consequently, there was limited attention paid to the solutions proposed by Hitler, despite his open anti-Semitism in public speeches. The Nazi leadership, while not eager to publicize the genocide, utilized the propaganda ministry to conceal the true situation of Jews in the Third Reich. Certain events, like Kristallnacht, where 30,000 Jews were detained in supposed spontaneous pogroms, made it impossible to conceal the violence. The occasional murders of Jews and communists in Berlin, where Western correspondents were present, also could not be hidden. Despite this, the Nazis attempted to control the narrative by limiting information about deportations to ghettos and camps, presenting it in a convenient way. After Kristallnacht, Propaganda Minister Goebbels organized a press conference to downplay the pogroms, framing them as a reaction of German society to the murder of a German diplomat by a Jew in Paris. Nazi leaders used rhetoric questioning the media's interest in Jewish matters and persuaded journalists to ignore these tragic events. Even during the war, the BBC avoided extensively covering the Holocaust in its broadcasts to avoid alienating anti-Semitic audiences. The Nazis crafted a narrative suggesting that the German authorities were effectively addressing the migration crisis by partially deporting migrants, exemplified by the expulsion of Polish Jews from the Reich and their resettlement in the ghetto, justified by claims of unsanitary conditions. Sparse details were available regarding the living conditions of Jews during this period. Prior to the war, foreign journalists were denied entry to the Jewish ghetto. The Nazis justified their restriction, stating, "It's unsanitary. We advise against visiting." Simultaneously, there existed a facility known as their Scienstadt, or their Scienstadt Ghetto, established in 1941 within the Czech Republic, where the Nazis allowed journalists entry. However, how did this camp differ from others like Buchenwald, Dachau, or Auschwitz? Their Scienstadt stood out for its comparatively vibrant cultural life, featuring concerts, lectures, and educational activities for Jewish children. This cultural vibrancy was facilitated by the fact that the ghetto was administered by the local Jewish authorities, along with the presence of numerous high-ranking Jews imprisoned there. Were the Nazis genuinely benevolent? Not at all. Their invitation to journalists was a propaganda tactic. In reality, approximately 33,000 individuals perished in their Scienstadt, mainly due to malnutrition and disease. Over 88,000 people were detained there for extended periods before being deported to extermination camps. Throughout the ghetto's existence, around 15,000 children resided in their Scienstadt, with roughly 90% succumbing to death after deportation. Officially, concentration camps were portrayed through propaganda as standard prisons for criminals, with no mention of the detention conditions. Some information did leak out, primarily through rumors, given that unlike regular prisons, individuals did not return from concentration camps. In the early years of the Second World War, when concentration camp prisoners began to be used in industrial production, their conditions became more evident. As mentioned earlier, journalists had no access to ghettos, and the situation of Jews varied significantly from one European country to another. This variation depended largely on whether foreign journalists had entry to the respective countries. In Western European countries, the situation for Jews during the initial years of Nazi occupation was comparatively less severe. For instance, French Jews were required to register with the police and wear yellow stars, but, overall, they did not face widespread persecution. The genocide against the Jews initially unfolded in areas inaccessible to foreign journalists. Numerous death camps were situated in the occupied territories of Poland, Belarus, Ukraine, and Russia, where a military regime was enforced. Correspondents from the United States reported from the Eastern Front, but their access was limited to locations permitted by the Wehrmacht command, tightly controlling the narrative. A 1941 Red Cross mission that visited German camps for Soviet prisoners of war on the Eastern Front found no evidence of human rights abuses or violations of the laws of war. In Germany itself, death camps were avoided, partly because even the Reich's laws did not officially permit the atrocities occurring in these death camps. These camps were exclusively established in occupied territories for the extermination of various groups, including Jews, communists, gays, gypsies, and Soviet prisoners of war. The extermination process was designed to keep the victims in the dark, with many Jews unaware of the true nature of their fate. Nazis often took individuals from Jewish ghettos, initially those unable to work, and transported them elsewhere without providing clear information. The case of the Vilnius ghetto in the occupied Soviet territory is illustrative, where 80,000 Jews were driven by the Nazis. The ghetto maintained the illusion of normal life with amenities like kindergartens, schools, libraries, and cultural institutions. The fate of those taken to the forest remained unknown. The situation became even more perplexing and horrifying during the deportation of Jews from Western Europe. French, Dutch, and Belgian Jews were sent in large numbers to death camps in Poland in 1942-43. The Jews themselves were unaware of their destination, believing that Auschwitz, for example, was a transit camp leading to a neutral country. Consequently, Jews from France traveled without escorts in regular passenger trains, with children inquiring at stations, "Will they be arriving at the camp soon?" The decision to eradicate the Jews was finalized in 1941-42, and the initial construction of cells in Auschwitz commenced in 1941. However, officially documented as a regular labor camp, Auschwitz's true nature was concealed from many, even within Germany, and certainly not from the Allies. The first revelations about the Holocaust originated from Poles and Soviet communists, as the Jews were exterminated within their territories. Polish partisans, supported by Jewish organizations under the underground Polish government, began collecting information early in the war, forming the Committee for the Relief of the Jews, known as Zygota. In addition to their efforts to save some Jews, Zygota meticulously gathered information about events in Poland, working with the understanding that by the time Poland regained independence, there might be no Jews left. Their goal was to ensure that the Allies could not claim ignorance about the extermination of the Jews after the war. Since 1940, a Polish partisan officer named Jan Karski operated in the Warsaw Ghetto. Fluent in several languages, including German, Karski, disguised as a German officer, entered the Warsaw Ghetto, capturing film footage depicting the inhumane conditions and the Nazis forcibly removing non-working individuals, including the elderly, children, and women, to death camps. Another Polish officer, Witold Pilecki, achieved the seemingly impossible feat of infiltrating the Auschwitz death camp. On September 17, 1941, Pilecki got captured on the streets of Warsaw, carrying forged documents under the name of a Polish officer. After spending days in prison, He was transported to Auschwitz, where he not only escaped in 1943 but also established an anti-Nazi underground. During this period, he gathered significant information about the inner workings of the death camp, coinciding with the installation of the first gas chambers in Auschwitz in 1941. The Nazis conducted initial tests on Soviet prisoners of war and Jews in September 1941, marking the commencement of the full-fledged death conveyor belt. According to Pilecki, the Nazis were cremating 8,000 people daily in Auschwitz. Shockingly, within just 3 years of German occupation, over one-third of Poland's Jewish population, exceeding 3 million people before the war, was annihilated. Simultaneously, the USSR shared its data with the global community. Despite many Soviet prisoners of war falling victim to Nazi camps, it's essential to note that the USSR, at that time, was rather sympathetic towards Jews, and the notion of persecution based on nationality was deemed unacceptable. For the communists, this stance served as a powerful element in the information war. Hitler's anti-Semitism had been exploited in Soviet propaganda since 1938, even before the war. Following the German attack on the Soviet Union in August 1941, a conference of Jewish cultural figures was convened, urging global Jewish solidarity with the Soviet Union. In 1942, the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee was established to establish connections with the Jewish diaspora in the United States. The committee's leader, renowned director Solomon Michaels, engaged with American and British elites, shedding light on the events in the occupied territories. Stalin, recognizing the potential of this information, ordered its meticulous documentation during the counteroffensive near Moscow in 1941. This information aimed to garner support from Western elites. In 1943, Soviet communists initiated the Black Book, exposing the widespread murder of Jews during the Holocaust. Completed by 1945, the book was never published in the USSR due to shifting political interests post-war. The Soviet Union, once a victor over Nazism, paradoxically began persecuting Jews during a post-war cosmopolitanism campaign. Solomon Michaels, the committee's leader, was murdered by Soviet security services on Stalin's orders. Returning to the Holocaust, Jan Karski remembered the initial British government reaction to his data. "Oh, it's too terrible to be true." On December 17, 1942, British and American media, based on Polish and Soviet intelligence, released the United Nations declaration recognizing Hitler's intention to exterminate all Jews in Germany. The report detailed ghettos, mass murders in occupied territories, and the Germans sending able-bodied Jews to labor camps while leaving elderly individuals to starve. However, even this report did not explicitly mention death camps, despite Pilecki's revelations. During the spring of 1944, 2 Jewish individuals, Rudolf Werba and Alfred Wetzler, managed a daring escape from Auschwitz, and eventually reached Slovakia and then London. Once there, they published a detailed report on the number and locations of gas chambers in the death camps. Simultaneously, the Red Army entered Poland, liberating the Treblinka death camp. Even soldiers hardened by the horrors of occupied territories were shocked by the sight of ovens and roads lined with ashes from the executed. It was only then that the West fully accepted the reality of the mass extermination of Jews by the Nazis. In response, British Air Force Commander Arthur Harris, known for the strategy of carpet bombing Germany, proposed bombing Auschwitz to halt the extermination. However, this plan was rejected due to fears that all prisoners, not just the perpetrators, might fall victim to the bombing. The Western Allies only fully grasped the extent of the horror in 1945 as the American Army liberated death camps en masse. However, Berlin continued to deny and dismiss Holocaust information as Polish and Soviet propaganda. Joseph Goebbels maintained the position that while Jews were isolated in ghettos and labor camps, any mortality was a result of starvation caused by Allied bombing. Simultaneously, the Nazis sought to conceal their crimes by initiating Operation 1005 on the Eastern Front in 1942. This operation aimed to obliterate all mass graves of genocide victims in Poland and the USSR. In occupied Kiev, an incident unfolded where a furnace was constructed for the prisoners of a German camp. Notably, the furnace was assembled using grave slabs and grates sourced from a Jewish cemetery. Over a month and a half, the prisoners were forced to exhume and incinerate the remains of the executed individual. When the supply of bodies depleted, the grim reality set in that those prisoners selected by the Nazis to burn the bodies would now become victims themselves. However, they were prepared for this dire situation and meticulously planned an escape over the course of a month. Using homemade lockpicks, they attempted to break free, but sadly, only 15 out of the 300 individuals involved in this escape managed to survive. From the accounts of these 15 survivors, we have gained significant insights into the executions and the efforts to conceal the traces of the Holocaust. Unfortunately, Not everyone shared the same fortune. Frequently, prisoners were forcibly marched far from the front lines, and under such grueling conditions, only a minority managed to reach the new camp. When evacuation wasn't possible for Jewish prisoners, attempts were made to kill and bury them before the arrival of American or Soviet tanks. However, this did not shield the orchestrators of the Holocaust from facing the Nuremberg tribunal. Nevertheless, a substantial portion of documents and evidence remained hidden. Even today, 80 years after the Holocaust, we lack a comprehensive understanding of the events and accurate data on the number of victims. The official estimate currently stands between 4.5 and 6 million people, as reported by predominantly Jewish organizations. Yet, the absence of precise information on the Holocaust unfolding allows some individuals to deny its occurrence, capitalizing on the remaining ambiguities and informational gaps.